Hey friend, welcome to True Crime Whispers Before Sleep. I'm really glad you're here. If you enjoy true crime stories told in a calm and relaxing way, you'll feel right at home. Before you get too cozy, tap that like button and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chilling case. And if you feel like it, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's story. In the summer of 2014, Katrina McGaw was enjoying a quiet evening at home in Ferguson, Missouri. She had just started settling into her new place, a modest ranch-style house she'd moved into only a few months earlier. That evening, Katrina sat down to watch a documentary about serial killers. It had been recommended by a family member, and like many people, Katrina was curious about true crime, about what makes a person cross the line into darkness. But she didn't expect the story to hit home, literally. As the documentary played, a chill ran down Katrina's spine. On the screen, they showed a crime scene, a small house in Ferguson, and she instantly recognized it. The layout, the brickwork, even the dining table and chairs. It was her house. Katrina realized she wasn't just watching any documentary. She was watching a story about the very place she now called home. And worse, it had once belonged to a man who had committed unthinkable acts within those same walls. The documentary called him the St. Louis Video Strangler. His real name was Maury Travis. Years earlier, Travis had brought women into that same house, tied them up, tortured them, and murdered them. The crimes had taken place right in the basement, a space Katrina had barely given a second thought to since moving in. But it was there, deep in the shadows of that home, that Maury Travis turned his darkest fantasies into reality. Crime scene photos in the documentary showed blood-stained floors and walls. Katrina stared in disbelief as she recognized pieces of furniture she used every day. She had eaten at that dining table, sat in those chairs. They had come with the house, a deal offered by the landlord. It turned out the furniture had once belonged to Maury Travis himself. Horrified, Katrina picked up the phone and called her landlord. She begged to be released from her lease, but the landlord refused. She showed no sympathy, none at all. Only later did Katrina find out the truth. Her landlord was Maury Travis's mother. Maury Travis's crimes were so brutal, so calculated, that even seasoned detectives had difficulty processing the details. He was believed to have murdered at least 17 women, possibly up to 20, in the early 2000s. Most were sex workers, women who had been pushed to the edges of society, living in a city marked by racial tension, poverty, and institutional neglect. He targeted them because they were vulnerable, because he knew no one would look for them right away, and because he thought no one would care. But someone did, and eventually, that attention brought him down. Before the headlines, before the arrest, and before the discovery of videotapes showing him torturing his victims, Maury Travis was just another quiet man living in Ferguson. To neighbors, he seemed normal, polite even. He held jobs, maintained his house, and drove a sleek black Mitsubishi Eclipse that he kept spotless. On the surface, there was nothing alarming about him. But below the surface, in the basement of his home, he was building something else. A space for suffering, control, and death. Maury Travis was born on October 25th, 1965, in St. Louis, Missouri. Just 3 days before the completion of the Gateway Arch, the city's proudest monument. But while the arch soared high into the sky, young Maury's world remained confined and tense. He grew up in a city known for deep racial divides and economic inequality. St. Louis had a long and painful history of housing segregation. Real estate practices kept black families from moving out of impoverished neighborhoods. Public schools were underfunded. Police departments overburdened. In this system, children like Maury Travis could slip through the cracks unnoticed. When he was 10, his family moved to Ferguson, a suburb just north of downtown St. Louis. On the outside, Maury was a quiet boy. Too quiet. A former neighbor remembered him as respectful, someone who mowed lawns and kept to himself. Teachers at his high school, McClure High, said he barely spoke. One of them recalled being surprised when his arrest made the news. She only remembered him because of how unusually silent he was in class. Even in his high school yearbook, Travis was barely a presence. He was forgettable. A ghost. Psychologists today might describe someone like young Maury as displaying callous and unemotional traits, a lack of empathy, shallow emotions, and an ability to hide their real feelings. These traits, when they appear in childhood, can be early signs of psychopathy. But back then, in the 1970s, no one would have noticed. And if they had, there was no system in place to help him. Maury graduated high school late, at the age of 20, and joined the Army Reserves, working as a medical and dental assistant. For a time, he volunteered at a local nursing home. At 22, he enrolled at Morris Brown College in Atlanta, where he first learned to use computers. But it was also around this time that he fell into addiction, smoking crack cocaine and spiraling into a life of petty crime. In the spring of 1988, Travis came back to Ferguson for a college break. Over 8 days, he robbed 5 shoe stores, using a plastic gun and stealing cash to support his addiction. He later claimed to have been spending $300 a day on crack. Police were able to track him down using his vehicle description. When they arrested him, they were surprised by his calm, polite behavior. He wasn't your typical criminal, one detective said. In court, Maury admitted guilt and said he barely remembered the robberies. He wasn't violent, just high, strung out, desperate. Even his sentencing judge acknowledged the crime seemed out of character. Maury was sentenced to 15 years, but he would only serve a little over 5. He was sent to Farmington Correctional Center, about 70 miles south of St. Louis. Only 2 months in, he wrote a plea letter to the judge, a desperate, emotional document where he said the prison conditions were breaking him. He cried every night. He thought about suicide constantly. In the letter, he asked for a second chance. It's unclear whether his suffering was genuine or another example of manipulation, something psychopaths are known for. Either way, the system took pity. He was paroled in 1994 at the age of 28. What followed was a series of short-lived attempts to live a normal life. He worked as a waiter. He lived next to a reverend. He volunteered. He seemed to stay out of trouble, but the addiction didn't go away. Travis was back in prison by 1998 for drug possession, a parole violation. He was released in 1999, then arrested again in 2000, released in 2001. Each time the sentence was short. Each time he got out and returned to the same habits. And by the early 2000s, Maury Travis's crimes took a darker turn. No more petty thefts, no more short-term violations. He had something else in mind. By the time Maury Travis was released from prison in early 2001, he was 35 years old. He had spent nearly a fifth of his life behind bars, and most of the rest bouncing between addiction, unemployment, and parole violations. But this time, he did something different. He bought a house. It was a small ranch-style home on Ford Drive in Ferguson, Missouri. The same house Katrina McGaw would rent over a decade later. To neighbors, Travis seemed like any other resident trying to get by. He trimmed the hedges, mowed his lawn, and polished his beloved black Mitsubishi Eclipse every weekend. He kept the house clean, the cars spotless, and the conversations brief. Inside, though, was another world. In that basement, Travis began to transform. The man who once cried himself to sleep in prison had become something far colder, something calculated. He didn't lash out in rage or lose control. Everything he did now had a structure, a rhythm. He built a space for torment. Not impulsively, not in chaos, but with planning, intention, and purpose. Maury Travis found his victims mostly in St. Louis's Baden neighborhood, especially along Broadway, a stretch known for street-level sex work. The women he picked up were usually in crisis, addicted, displaced, struggling to survive. Many used crack cocaine just as Travis did. That gave him an opening, a shared dependency, a false sense of comfort. He would offer money, drugs, or both. Some nights, Travis filmed what appeared to be consensual encounters. The women would smoke crack, engage in sex, and leave unharmed. But other nights, they never came out of that house. They disappeared. The shift from drug use to murder wasn't dramatic. It crept in. One woman didn't leave, then another. Soon, Travis was imprisoning women in his basement for days at a time, blindfolding them, binding their hands and legs, and taping their eyes shut. He kept them shackled to a support beam in the dark, and he filmed it all. Using a VHS camcorder, Travis documented what he did to these women. He turned his basement into a stage. He gave commands, forced them to dance, made them repeat phrases like, "You are the master. It pleases me to serve you," over and over. There were no masks, no aliases, just him, in full control, recording everything. At first, the women didn't know what was happening. Many thought it was a role play, that it was part of the transaction. But as the hours turned into days, the fear took over. Travis didn't just hurt them physically. He taunted them, shamed them, and berated them for their addiction, all while forcing them deeper into the same trap he was caught in. To understand what Maury Travis was doing, it's important to see it clearly. This wasn't about impulse or anger. It was about power. The kind of control he felt he never had growing up, in school, in prison. Now he wielded it with absolute authority. And it wasn't just physical control, it was emotional dominance too. In one recording, he spoke softly to a woman as he tortured her. He asked if she was sorry. When she answered yes, he pressed further. Sorry about what? She told him, sorry to her children. Travis snapped. You're not raising your kids, he said coldly. You over here on your back smoking crack. You ain't going home tomorrow. I'm gonna keep you about a week. He was angry, but not in the way most would expect. He was angry at himself, at his own addiction. By hurting these women, he was also punishing the part of himself he hated. And he was doing it in the most controlling way possible. The first known body was found on April 1st, 2001. It was Alyssa Greenwade, a 34-year-old mother of two who had struggled with crack cocaine addiction. She had recently started staying with a local reverend who tried to help her get clean. Just before her disappearance, she told the reverend she had met a new man and felt safe with him. 9 hours later, she was found partially clothed and strangled, dumped in a ditch in East St. Louis. No ID, no purse, no answers. Then came Teresa Wilson. Teresa was 36 and had grown up in the Baden neighborhood. As a teen, she wasn't involved with hard drugs. She became a mother at 17, raising a daughter with love and structure. But over time, crack took hold of her too. To support her addiction, she turned to sex work. Her life became unstable, and her daughter was eventually placed in a children's home. On May 15, 2001, Teresa's body was found in West Alton, Missouri, 30 miles from where Alyssa had been discovered. Like Alyssa, she had been strangled and dumped. Her body was so decomposed that only a dental plate inscribed with the word "Wills" allowed for identification. Two women, two dump sites, two crimes too similar to ignore. Police began to connect the dots. On May 23, 2001, a third body turned up. Betty James, 46, another sex worker. She had also been strangled. What disturbed investigators most was a tire mark across her leg. Clear evidence that the killer had run her over. Then, on June 29th, another body. Veronica Thompson, 36, found near the same location as Teresa Wilson, just 16 feet away. That made 4 women in 2 months. Police could no longer dismiss the possibility of a serial killer. They formed a multi-jurisdictional task force, pulling in the FBI, the Illinois State Police, and homicide detectives from across the region. They analyzed each case, the way the women were found, the manner of death, their histories, and how close the dump sites were to one another. The killer wasn't sloppy, but he was making small mistakes. And soon, he would make a big one. On July 4th, 2001, something unusual happened on Ford Drive. A woman was seen running naked from Maury Travis's home, screaming for help. Neighbors called the police. When officers arrived, they found Travis calm and composed. He claimed the woman had drugged him, tried to rob him, and fled. The woman said he had assaulted her, but no charges were filed. Neither party wanted to press the issue. It could have been the moment everything unraveled, but it wasn't. Not yet. Travis returned to his quiet life. The car stayed polished, the house stayed clean, and the killings continued. On August 25th, 2001, the body of Yvonne Cruz was found. She too had been strangled and dumped. 2 weeks later, on October 8th, Brenda Beasley was discovered under similar conditions. But there was a key difference this time. On both women, police found semen, something they hadn't recovered before. And when they tested it, the DNA matched. They now had confirmation. The same man had killed both Yvonne and Brenda. It was the break they needed. But there was a problem. The DNA didn't match anyone in the National Criminal Database. Why? Because Travis's earlier crimes, the shoe store robberies, had happened before Missouri began collecting DNA from felons. He had slipped through a gap in the system, and for a while, that gap protected him. By the fall of 2001, the streets of St. Louis had gone quieter, but not in the way anyone hoped. For months, the bodies of women had been turning up like clockwork, every 6 to 8 weeks. Each discovery carried the same horror: strangulation, partial nudity, signs of restraint, and dump sites carefully chosen in overgrown lots or abandoned spaces. By October, the city had recovered 6 victims. Then suddenly, it stopped. No new victims, no fresh clues. The task force combed through connections, evidence, and witness statements, but it all led to a dead end. And then came September 11th. The terror attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. captured the entire nation's attention. Newsrooms shifted focus, law enforcement redirected resources, and in St. Louis, the fear of a serial killer slowly faded into the background, at least in the public's eyes. But Will Smith, a reporter at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, couldn't shake the feeling that something had been missed. The victims, women like Alyssa Greenwade and Teresa Wilson, weren't just names on a list. They had families. They had lives. They deserved to be seen as more than just casualties of a secret predator. So he wrote. On May 19, 2002, Smith's article appeared on the front page of the Post-Dispatch. It was a profile of Teresa Wilson, one of the early victims. But this was no cold recounting of her death. Smith wrote about Teresa's childhood, her struggles with addiction, her efforts to be a good mother, her attempts to climb back from the edge. He spoke to people who had known her, people who loved her, and people who remembered how hard she tried, even when it seemed like the world had forgotten her. It wasn't just about Wilson. It was a call for empathy, for the public to remember that these women weren't throwaways. They were human beings. The article had its intended effect. Readers paid attention. The conversation about the victims changed. But it also caught the eye of someone else. Someone who didn't like how the story was being told. Someone who wanted to remind the world who was really in control. 5 days later, on May 24, 2002, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch received an envelope with no return name, just an address. One that, on first glance, appeared to be from New York. Inside was a printed letter and a map. The letter was short, typed in blocky font. It read, "Nice sob story about Teresa Wilson. Write a good one about Greenwade, and I'll tell you where many others are. To prove I'm real, here's directions to number 17. Search a 50-yard radius from the X. The map was a printed screenshot, a digital cutout of a vacant lot in West Alton, Missouri, not far from where earlier victims had been found. An X marked the spot. The envelope had no fingerprints, no DNA. The stamp was placed upside down, a traditional signal of distress, or perhaps an intentional flourish from someone who wanted to be noticed. The return address was fake, a bondage website URL with a made-up sender's name and a New York address. But the postmark was local. It didn't take long for law enforcement to understand what they were holding. It was a letter from the killer. On the morning of May 25th, 2002, a squad of detectives arrived at the vacant lot in West Alton. They had printed copies of the map. They knew what they were looking for. They didn't have to search long. Detective Marcia Corley was walking along the edge of an old railroad track when she saw what looked like a pale mushroom poking through the weeds. As she got closer, her breath caught. It wasn't a mushroom. It was a human skull. Nearby, more skeletal remains were scattered through the grass. A torso, still partially clothed in a woman's dress, lay a few yards away. The bones were bleached from months in the sun. The decomposition was advanced, but there was no doubt. The map was real, and the person who sent it knew the victim was there, because he put her there. Until that moment, authorities had recovered 10 bodies, only 7 of which could be identified. But in the letter, the writer claimed this was number 17. It was a disturbing revelation. Either the killer was inflating his count to confuse investigators, or there were at least 7 more victims no one had found yet. For detectives, both possibilities were horrifying. But one thing was certain: the killer had just made a mistake. He had reached out, left a digital trace, mailed physical evidence, put himself back on the board. He wasn't as invisible as he thought. The key to finding him lay in the map. It had been printed from the travel site Expedia.com, which was owned at the time by Microsoft. Investigators served a grand jury subpoena, requesting records of all users who had searched for West Alton, Missouri in the days before the letter was mailed. It was a long shot, but it worked. The team narrowed the search to one IP address. Just one person had zoomed in on that exact area, on those exact coordinates, between May 18th and May 21st, the dates when the killer likely prepared the letter. That IP address was assigned by WorldCom, a major internet provider at the time. Another subpoena, another trace, and then they had a name: Maury Travis. By June 4th, 2002, the FBI and local police had Maury Travis under 24-hour surveillance. They knew where he lived. They knew about his past convictions, and they knew his address was just a short drive from several dump sites. What they didn't yet have was a warrant to search the house. But it was coming. 3 days later, on the morning of June 7th, agents knocked on the door of 1001 Ford Drive. Maury Travis answered in his underwear. He didn't seem surprised. He didn't ask why they were there. He let them in. Still half asleep and in his underwear, he didn't seem startled. He didn't ask what was going on. He just looked at them. Calm. Quiet. Waiting. When they showed him the search warrant, he nodded. No protest, no argument. He got dressed, then joined them in the living room. From the start, Travis tried to maintain control. He chose where to sit. He asked questions casually. When the officers tried small talk, "Where'd you grow up?" or "What kind of work have you done?" he answered with deflections. One-word replies, repeated questions, shrugs. But what stood out most wasn't what he said. It was what he did. Each time one of the detectives leaned down to pet his calico cat, Travis stiffened. After the second time, he picked the cat up and moved it out of their reach, placing it beside him protectively. To the agents, it was a small but telling moment. The cat was his property, his control. In that moment, it was the one thing in the room he still had power over, and he didn't like anyone else touching it. The upstairs of Travis's house was as expected, neat, organized, spotless. Carpets vacuumed, counters wiped down, dishes cleaned. But when the FBI evidence recovery team stepped into the basement, everything changed. The air was heavy, the light dim, and the basement, unlike the rest of the home, was in disarray. A mattress on the floor, ropes, belts, stains, scrapes on the walls, hooks in the ceiling, blood, some of it faint, some of it visible, all of it real. It didn't take long for the agents to realize they were standing in the exact place so many women had described before they disappeared forever. This was the prison. This was where it all happened. Then behind a false wall, they found the final piece, a VHS tape labeled wedding tape. The first hour and 26 minutes showed a real wedding. Family, music, joy. But after that, something else entirely. The detectives sat together to review the footage. They knew it would be bad, but they weren't prepared for what they saw. The camera showed Maury Travis. There was no mask, no disguise. It was him, calm, composed, methodical. The footage began with one woman. She was naked, blindfolded, her hands tied. Travis taunted her, demanded she say things like, "You are the master." He made her repeat it, again and again. Then he placed a belt around her neck. He strangled her, slowly, until she stopped moving. He did not turn the camera away. The tape continued. Other women appeared, some older, some younger. One by one, Travis did the same thing. Stun gun, verbal abuse, sexual assault, strangulation. There were moments where he spoke softly, others where he exploded with rage. And through it all, he filmed. When the tape ended, there was no doubt. Maury Travis had documented his crimes in full detail. He had created his own private film, not as a trophy, but as a way to relive the power, replay the control, and feed the same need over and over. The detectives, some with decades of experience, were shaken. Counseling was offered to everyone who viewed it. Back in the living room, Travis sat between FBI Special Agent Robert Morton and Detective Tim Sachs. They didn't arrest him immediately. They didn't accuse. Instead, they kept the tone casual, conversational, friendly. They showed him photos of the victims, smiling pictures taken before their deaths. Travis looked at them and said he didn't know any of them. 10 minutes later, he asked to see the pictures again. "You know these girls were murdered," Sachs told him, though they hadn't said that before. It was a trick, an interrogation tactic, and it worked. Travis dropped his head. "You got me," he said quietly. Then he looked up. "Come on," he said. "I'll take you." "You'll take us where?" the agents asked. "You know where," Travis replied. "It's what you've been asking for this whole time. I'll give you what you want." The three men got into a squad car. Travis sat in the back. He told them to drive east, across the Mississippi River, toward East St. Louis. For a few minutes, they believed he was actually going to show them where other victims were buried. But as they neared the bridge, something in him shifted. He stared out the window. His posture changed. Then he spoke. "I changed my mind," he said. "Take me to jail." He repeated it, louder this time. "Take me to jail, lock me out." He wouldn't say why. He wouldn't say more. The agents turned the car around and drove him back to St. Louis Police Headquarters. Over the next several hours, Maury Travis was questioned repeatedly. He didn't confess, but he didn't deny either. He seemed more interested in how he had been caught. They told him about the map. He cursed the internet, muttering that he should have known better. He asked several times what he would tell his mother. He didn't talk about his victims. He didn't apologize. But his one concern, the only sliver of emotion he showed, was how his mother would see him. The mask had started to crack, but he wasn't done playing the game. While Travis sat in custody, the FBI continued processing the house. They found blood on the walls and floors, ropes, belts, and shackles, women's underwear and wigs, a stun gun, a hand-drawn diagram for building a concrete holding cell in the basement, notes describing how to pick up, restrain, and dispose of victims, marked maps of local areas, places to find sex workers, and places to dump bodies. They also examined the tires on Travis's Mitsubishi Eclipse. They matched the tread marks found on Betty James's leg. The noose was tightening. Maury Travis was placed in a one-man cell on the 8th floor of the St. Louis County Justice Center. It was a maximum security unit. He was being held on 2 federal kidnapping charges, tied to the deaths of Alyssa Greenwade and Betty James. But everyone knew more charges were coming. Evidence was still being processed. DNA testing was underway, and prosecutors were preparing for what would likely be a capital murder trial. He wouldn't be getting out. Not this time. Travis had been in prison before, but this time was different. This time, he wasn't a man trying to get clean. He wasn't just another drug offender hoping for leniency. This time, he was a man the world now knew as a serial killer, and it was a title he wasn't willing to carry. On July 10th, 2002, just 3 days after his arrest, Maury Travis was found hanging in his cell. He had used a bedsheet, twisted tightly and fed through a vent above the toilet. He had bound his own hands behind his back. He'd stuffed toilet paper into his nostrils and gagged himself with a washcloth. Over his head, he'd pulled a pillowcase. It was as methodical as everything else he'd done. Even in death, Travis showed the same level of control and planning that defined his crimes. He took no chances that he might survive the attempt. He eliminated the body's natural reflexes, gagging, gasping, by disabling his own mouth and nose. He didn't want there to be any mistakes, and there weren't. Travis was supposed to be on suicide watch. Mental health staff had evaluated him just 2 days earlier. A guard was instructed to check his cell every 15 minutes, and a fellow inmate, part of a peer observation program, was posted outside his cell as an added precaution. It should have been enough, but that night, 2 scheduled checks never happened, at 7:30 p.m. and 7:45 p.m. At 7 p.m., Travis's cell door automatically unlocked for an hour of day room time. He stepped out briefly into the vestibule outside his cell, the one area where the inmate observer couldn't see fully into the back corner. He took a shower. Then, at 7:15 p.m., he stepped back inside. He had 45 minutes of unsupervised access. That's all it took. At 8 p.m., when the door locked again, the observer looked through the window and saw his body hanging. It was the first suicide at the facility since it had opened. Authorities found a suicide note addressed to his mother. In it, Travis apologized for being sick in the head. He told her she had been a good mother, that he had never felt normal, never felt happy. He wrote, "I think about the life I led and the months ahead of me. This seems to be the best solution for all involved, especially me, because I won't spend the rest of my life locked up. Or worse, let them kill me with a needle." He ended the note with a final message to his mother. "Tell everyone I love them. I love you most, but you know that." Travis's death stunned the investigators. They weren't just hoping for a conviction, they were hoping for answers. Travis had claimed in his letter to the Post-Dispatch that he had 17 victims, but police had only identified 10 bodies, and only 7 of those were fully confirmed. What about the rest? Where were they? And who were they? Now they would never know. By dying before trial, Travis robbed the victims' families of justice. He took away the opportunity for them to ask why, and hear the answer from the man who had taken so much. He kept the final secrets to himself. To law enforcement and psychologists, Travis's suicide wasn't just about shame. It wasn't simply fear of a needle or life in prison. It was about power. In life, Travis had always sought control. Over his home, over his routines, over the women he brought into his basement. Every act of torture, every videotape, every forced ritual, it was all about dominance. Now, facing a system that had finally cornered him, He made sure the last move was still his. He decided when the story ended. Not everyone believed it. Some of Travis's relatives, especially his cousins, said the suicide didn't make sense to them. They couldn't understand how he'd done it under suicide watch. They pointed out that if he'd wanted to die, he could have done it before he was ever arrested. One cousin, Stephanie Talley, said, "It just doesn't add up. I don't believe his death was a suicide. I don't. Not in my heart." But investigators stood firm. The autopsy showed no signs of struggle, no bruising, no trauma beyond the marks from the noose. His wrists were bound, yes, but in a way that someone could do to themselves, slowly and deliberately. It was suicide, plain and cold, and Travis had made sure it worked. For the families of his victims, the suicide brought a complicated mix of emotions. Some were angry, others felt robbed, a few felt numb. Melinda Greenwade, sister of victim Alyssa Greenwade, said, "I wanted to talk to him. I wanted to ask him why." But she never got the chance, and likely never will. Maury Travis died alone in a locked cell, in the silence he had always preferred. But the noise he left behind never really stopped. The house at 1001 Ford Drive was quiet again. The crime scene tape came down. The basement was cleaned. Years passed. Neighborhoods changed, and the story began to fade from public memory. Just another dark chapter in the long history of St. Louis. But not for the families, not for the detectives, not for the city that unknowingly housed a man who filmed his murders while neighbors waved from across the lawn. And not for Katrina McGaw. It was the summer of 2014, 12 years after Travis's arrest and death, when Katrina settled into her new rental home in Ferguson, Missouri. It was a good deal, a furnished house with everything she needed, a quiet neighborhood, simple, comfortable. She didn't know what had happened there. No one told her. One night, she was watching a documentary about serial killers, something true crime related. One of those shows recommended by a family member. The usual intrigue, morbid curiosity. Then she saw it, the house on the screen. Her house. She froze. The floors, the layout, the furniture, even the dining table she ate at every night. It was all there. A crime scene. A place of suffering. The home of a man who had imprisoned, tortured, and murdered women in the very basement she'd walked past without a second thought. Panicked, she called the landlord, begging to be released from her lease. The landlord refused. Only later did Katrina discover the reason why. The woman she had been paying rent to, the woman who had offered her a furnished deal, was Sandra Travis, Maury Travis's mother. Missouri law does not require landlords to disclose if a violent crime, suicide, or murder has taken place on the property. Legally, no one had to tell Katrina, but ethically, it left scars. The St. Louis Housing Authority eventually stepped in and helped dissolve the lease. Katrina moved out, but the story made headlines again. Suddenly, the house was back in the public eye. The basement returned to the city's imagination. And people asked the same question all over again. How many women had died there? The truth, no one knows. When Maury Travis sent that typed letter to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, he claimed 17 victims. Police recovered 10 bodies. 7 remain unaccounted for, at least by his count. And there's always the chilling possibility that the number was even higher. But the tragedy isn't just the number. It's how many of those women were never identified. They were found in ditches, empty lots, alleys overrun with weeds. No ID, no purse, no one searching for them. Their families either never knew they were gone, or never knew where to look. And some women may never have been found at all. Their final resting places could be anywhere in the miles of empty space surrounding St. Louis, left to weather and time. Even in death, they remained invisible. Maury Travis was able to operate as long as he did, not because he was brilliant, but because the women he chose were ignored by society. Most of them were sex workers. Most had drug addictions. Most came from underfunded neighborhoods with little access to protection or support. That made them perfect targets. When a sex worker goes missing, the response is rarely swift. Many police departments are overworked, and the legal system treats sex work as a crime, not a public health issue. As a result, those who are most at risk often receive the least protection. And that's exactly what Travis counted on. But one person refused to look away. Will Smith, a journalist at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, couldn't stop thinking about the victims. He had no idea that his article about Teresa Wilson, written to humanize her, would flush out the killer himself. But it did. Smith's writing forced the city to look beyond mugshots and rap sheets. He reminded readers that these women were people. Daughters, mothers, sisters, friends. They laughed. They loved. They fought to survive. He told the stories no one else wanted to tell. And in doing so, he stirred something in Maury Travis. A desire to reassert control, to correct the narrative, to send that infamous letter. That letter, and the map inside, led investigators to Travis's computer. That map ended his spree. One of the most sobering realizations in this story is how close Travis came to getting away. When he printed that map from Expedia.com, internet crime investigations were still new. The idea of tracing an IP address to an individual user was cutting edge at the time. Exactly 4 months after Travis printed his map, the Tor project, a free tool to anonymize internet activity, was released to the public. Had Travis waited just a few more months, or used better digital hygiene, he might have stayed hidden. He might have killed again. The tools that caught him came just in time. It's easy to call someone like Maury Travis a monster. It makes the story simpler, cleaner, easier to digest. But monsters aren't real. People are. Maury Travis was born. He had a mother who loved him. He went to school. He wore uniforms. He walked down the street like anyone else. He paid bills, cleaned his car, helped neighbors carry groceries. And behind all of that, he planned the deaths of women whose lives he didn't think mattered. He was not a monster. He was a man who made calculated choices and believed no one would stop him. The house on Ford Drive still stands. The basement is still there, but the bodies are gone. The crime scene tape is long removed. The VHS tapes are locked away in evidence storage. The voices of the women he hurt have fallen silent. All that's left are the ripples. The mothers who never got answers. The sisters who never got justice. The children who never saw their mothers again. the names that were never even written down, and a reporter who tried to make sure someone remembered. Maury Travis once said, during interrogation, that he'd felt this way his whole life, that something was wrong with him from the beginning. He never smiled, never felt happy. He said it calmly, like it was just another fact. Maybe that's true. But whatever he lacked in feeling, he made up for in harm. He left behind a trail of bodies, broken families, and a basement that still echoes in nightmares. And still, we don't know the whole story, but we know enough. Enough to remember the women, enough to keep asking the hard questions, enough to never call them invisible again. Maury Travis is gone, but the women he targeted, the ones he thought no one would miss, deserve to be remembered. Their stories matter. If this case affected you, or made you think about how society treats its most vulnerable, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Not for the views, but because the more we remember these names, the less likely they are to be erased. Another case drops tomorrow. Until then, thanks for watching. Stay safe and take care of each other.